So let's first look at the CRM architecture. So CRM supports several different deployment options depending upon what you might need from an organization standpoint. Depending upon your current infrastructure and maybe other factors, you might elect to go with Dynamic CRM Online. CRM Online scales very nicely from small organizations with even just 5 to 10 to 20 users all the way up to large-scale enterprise level deployments. If you have clients that have very specific needs or already have the infrastructure in place, you could elect to go with kind of an on-premise deployment. Now, when you start talking about going with on-premise deployment, now you do need to make sure that you have the architecture in place that can handle that. So the hardware and the software licensing that would allow you to be able to deploy that based upon the size of your organization. Now, the nice thing with that is if you do choose to go with an on-premise type of deployment, CRM does support multi-tenant architecture, which basically means that if you have one CRM deployment, you can have multiple organizations on that CRM deployment. So that could be very handy if you have two very distinct businesses operating under the same company or the same corporation, so they need separate instances of CRM, but they both need CRM within part of the application. Or maybe you're a company that wants to do hosting for partners, you would have the capabilities to provision a CRM deployment and then have multiple instances or multiple organizations running on top of that. If you elect to go with the on-premise deployment, remember that CRM runs off a SQL server, so it will need a SQL backend to be able to functionize and work with the application itself. And we'll talk more about the actual supporting technologies here in just a couple of seconds. First, let's talk just a little bit about licensing from a licensing perspective. CRM does support a few different license options. And now the nice thing with CRM licensing is the licensing is the same whether you're using an on-premise type of situation or whether you're using an online situation. Obviously, there's different price points depending upon if you're going online versus on-premise, but what you have from an access standpoint is essentially the same regardless of what you're using. So if you look at CRM licensing, the first one that you have is your essential licensing. This is really more for users who are not necessarily tied to a specific role within the functionality, but they may still need access to the application to access activities and see what's going on. They're not necessarily going to interact with the application, but they need to have the ability to, at a glance, see what's happening from the application perspective. Then you get into kind of your basic licensing. So these are people who actually need to use the application. Maybe they need to be able to create contacts or work with contacts in the application. Maybe they need to be able to work with leads or handle cases, but they're going to be interacting with the application. So basic is really your first tier of database access to the application from a read-write perspective. This is also very nice for analysts who might need reporting capabilities and be able to really see what's happening from an application standpoint. When you start getting into your professional license, this is really probably the most common license that's used from an application perspective, because this is where your sales team has access to all of the different module capabilities. So they have the capabilities to go in and start, working with sales, working with service and marketing from that standpoint. And then your enterprise level is where you start getting into more of your marketing and customer service departments, where you really need to have all of the capabilities of CRM, but maybe you also need to have, Microsoft Dynamics marketing, so you want to integrate it with a marketing perspective, and maybe you also want to use, other products such as like Parature for portal access and some of those types of different situations. So that's where you start to see the different licensing models, but really professional is probably what you're going to see most often from a commonality standpoint with most users, unless you really truly need to get into other Microsoft Dynamics applications like MDM or Parature. So as I mentioned, if you do decide to go with an on-premise deployment, it's important to note that you do have different technologies that are there to support CRM. And as I mentioned in a previous slide, SQL Server is probably one of the biggest scenarios, because that's where your database is actually going to be hosted. So not only is this going to contain your configuration database for your organization, but it's also going to contain each one of the organizations that are running on that CRM environment. So your SQL Server is very important to back end kind of your CRM database from an application perspective. There's also going to be reporting services. So CRM is built from a reporting perspective to use SQL reporting services to run reports. Now, from an online perspective, it actually allows you to create custom reports using Fetch XML, but from an on-premise standpoint, having a reporting server available is what is going to process your reports and make those available. And so if you have custom reports that you want to upload or schedule, you will use reporting services for that. Now, reporting services, depending upon the size of your organization, you may elect to have that on the same SQL server as your database, or you may elect to deploy a completely separate reporting services or server based upon your specific needs. Now, another factor that plays into CRM from an on-premise perspective is IIS, or Internet Information Services. This is actually the technology that is going to host CRM from a web application standpoint. So CRM's website will be hosted using IIS, and this is where all of your web services that you would be interacting with, specifically if you were a developer, will also be hosted within the application itself. Another area that is a supporting technology that's critical to note is Active Directory. Now, Active Directory from an on-premise perspective is really just used for user authentication. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the user module here in just a little bit. But from an Active Directory standpoint, each user has to exist in Active Directory before they can be added as CRM users. In addition to that, CRM has 4 security groups that get added into Active Directory as well. And this is used to provide, access to the application as well as some of the reporting functionality within the application as well. Now, depending upon whether you want CRM to be just internally facing or if you want it to be externally facing, you may also need to bring in what is called Active Directory Federation Services. And Active Directory Federation Services, or ADFS, is really used to handle authentication on the application, particularly if you want to provide kind of a secure authentication mechanism to CRM for internal access, or if you want to expose it externally within the application itself. And so ADFS is basically a required component if you want to look at external access. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be ADFS, but it has to be some type of SSL application that would provide you the ability to work with tokens. Now, at the same point, you can also use Azure. And from an Azure perspective, CRM Online actually hosts all of the users that are using CRM in an Azure Active Directory account. And so one of the things that you can do with Active Directory Federation Services in Azure is you actually have the capabilities to link those together, so you actually could federate to an online deployment using your local domain network account if you wanted to. Now, there's a little bit of extra configuration in there, but it gives you an option to be able to tie those together. Now, a couple of other technologies that you at least want to keep in mind from or be aware of, that they may not always be in a CRM implementation, but they will usually play some factor, would be SharePoint. CRM does provide the capabilities to do some document management and some of those capabilities within the application, but it doesn't allow you to do true document management. You can do attachments and you can add notes, but there's no way to really track versioning or those types of situations, or check in, check out, or any of those scenarios. So SharePoint gives you the capabilities to replace some of CRM's kind of document capabilities with SharePoint from a document management standpoint, so you truly have the ability to check in and check out documents, collaborate together, and even provide non-CRM users with a mechanism to see some of the documents that may have been uploaded through CRM. The nice thing with SharePoint is it supports both a client or a server-side model, where you can do direct server integration, or you can install what's called the SharePoint list component, and you can actually have that integration take place at a client level. From an Exchange standpoint, CRM doesn't process emails. However, emails can be flagged as activities in the application itself. And so if I send an email to a customer, I may want that to show up in CRM as an email activity. So with that, you may need to tie or link CRM with an Exchange server. Now, Exchange supports several different options. You can install a piece called the email router, where you can use that to deliver and forward emails accordingly based upon specific needs. It does support server-side syncing, which is very common in a scenario where you might be using CRM Online. You also have the capability to use just the Outlook client to be able to handle tracking of email. But either way, you still have to have an email server that is processing that email, and typically Microsoft Exchange is one of the more popular ones that are used specifically with Dynamics CRM. So let's talk just a little bit about the CRM experience. So when users start accessing CRM, things have changed. It used to just be that everybody used the web to access applications. Now there's so many different types of users that are out there, and there's so many different platforms that are available to us that everybody's using things a little bit different. So CRM does allow you to really provide the users the application in many different presentation models. You can do that through the web client. You can do that through an Outlook client, which is specifically built to run on top of Microsoft Outlook. It also provides a mechanism for working with phone and tablets, or depending upon your specific needs, you can do completely custom clients. You could actually design your own client that interfaces or maybe performs specific CRM functionality within the application. Now, building a custom client is a little bit out of the scope of this particular course, but it's important to note that that is truly an option that you would have available to you when you're working through it. Let's first just talk a little bit about the web client. So from a web client standpoint, CRM is a multiple browser application. So it does support both IE10 and IE11. It also does support Microsoft Edge, as well as Mozilla Firefox, Chrome, and then Apple Safari. Now, the important thing to note with Safari is only if you're running on iOS devices. So if you're running on a Mac, or if you're running on iPad, or anything that would be using an information from there. So it's important to note that because your users do have the capabilities to access different browsers, when we do make some of these customizations, you do want to test the customizations on all the different browsers that users might be using, just to make sure that they are coming across the way that they are supposed to. Now, in addition to using the traditional web client, one of the things that really sets CRM apart from an application perspective is the ability to use Outlook. And so CRM actually has kind of two Outlook mechanisms that you can use. The first is what's called the traditional Outlook client, and has really been around since CRM version 3. And what this is this is a standalone piece of software that you would install on a client machine and link it directly to their Outlook client. And within this is where now if emails are coming in to the application, those emails based upon user preferences can actually be set to be automatically tracked in CRM. So it is actually going in and tracking those emails and creating email activities in the application. The other thing that's nice about the Outlook client is it provides access to the application directly through Outlook. So they don't actually have to open up the Outlook client. They can actually look at things like accounts, contacts, opportunities, and custom entities directly within the Outlook client itself. And then there's a mechanism that you can use to synchronize specific CRM information with Outlook folders. So if you have contacts that are in Outlook, those contacts can be synced directly with Dynamic CRM. So if a change is made in either one of those areas, those changes are automatically pushed. The other thing, depending upon the version of the Outlook client that you install, you also have the capabilities to use it offline. So if you have customers, maybe that are going into government-based situations where they don't have, external Wi-Fi to external users, maybe they still need the capabilities to work with this information offline. The Outlook client does provide that capability. Now, one of the other options that they have that has been recently introduced is what's called the app for Outlook. And the nice thing about the app for Outlook is you don't actually have to have an installation of a client. What this actually allows you to do is to track CRM information through Outlook and work with Outlook, CRM information without actually having to install the application. Now, the nice thing is because the app for Outlook, or the Outlook app, actually works at kind of a server level, you can use it on a traditional Outlook client, or if you have customers who are using Outlook Web Access, they can also access the CRM information using OWA, which using the traditional Outlook client just wouldn't be an option. And so it's important to note, from a customization standpoint, that people might be accessing this information using Outlook, and you just want to make sure that you visually tested that information to make sure that it's appearing the way that it should. And it usually does, because it uses the same form interface as the web-based application. Another client that people are using that's very common right now is mobile clients. So if you think about it, everybody's got tablets now where a lot of people are accessing information on their phone. And they've put a lot of effort into streamlining this process a little bit to make it easier to access this information, whether it is on a phone or a tablet client. So from a customization standpoint, when you make changes to the application, those changes will also push out to the mobile clients. And so from a mobility standpoint, there's two different platforms. It's the same interface, but it looks differently based upon the presentation that you're using. So from a tablet perspective, you'll see that it's much more kind of laid out with a little bit more white space to allow you to kind of horizontally move from one area to another. The nice thing with tablets is it supports your dashboards that you have in CRM. It also gives you the capabilities to open this information up in a browser. So if you want to look at it in a traditional CRM manner, you would have the capabilities to work with it from there. You also have the capability with the tablet client to actually create records offline. So if you lose connection for some reason, you can create new records, and then when you get back into an online scenario where you actually have connectivity, you can synchronize those drafts back up to the application. From a phone perspective, it's very similar to the tablet client, except for it's more streamlined to basically show things in one screen. So as you swipe back and forth to the right and to the left, different columns or different screens will actually show up that will reflect the different columns that you see within the tablet client. Now, one of the nice things about the phone client is you can choose to take functionality and hide it from the phone. So if there's fields, sections, or tabs that would be beneficial in the tablet client, but they wouldn't necessarily work well in the phone client just from a visualization standpoint, you do have the capabilities to hide that information based upon your specific needs. Now, another option that you have is USD, or Unified Service Desk. So this is really a desktop application that is actually installed on a client machine, and this is primarily done with call center scenarios. So if you have help desk centers or you have people who are trying to service multiple customers at one time, you can actually use Unified Service Desk. And the nice thing about this is this allows you to connect the application not only to CRM, but you can actually connect this to other line of business applications. So if you had other web-based applications that you need to transfer contextual information across from, you would be able to work with it from there. The idea being that, in CRM, when you open up a record or you open up a related record, everything opens inline within the application. From a USD perspective, you can actually group some of this information into different sessions. And so as you see kind of on the top part in that blue tab, we have kind of a session for a Datum Corporation. Using USD, I could have different sessions open for different account records that are associated with it. And then within those sessions, I could actually have, cases being displayed, contacts being displayed. It actually gives me a mechanism to be able to work with multiple records at one time without having to open them up in multiple windows. And the nice thing about the USD perspective is there is a sample solution that you can actually bring into the application that allows you to kind of demo the functionality. And one of the things that you'll see is that from configuring how the users interface with the application, all that configuration is actually done directly through the CRM application. And then obviously the other option that you have would be to create your own custom client. So maybe you want to have a mobile application that all it does is work with activity feeds. If you had developers on staff, you would have the capabilities to create kind of a custom mobile application that could connect directly to CRM and provide that kind of specific targeted functionality within the application itself. Now let's talk just a little bit about how these customizations come to be. So when you start customizing the CRM application, one of the key pieces that play a factor into this is what's called the platform layer. And that's really the key to understanding CRM architecture as it relates to customizations, because that's really the intermediary between the software developer and the actual database itself. And so what this platform does is it gives you specific CRM APIs that you can use to actually handle interaction with the database itself. And so this will determine, when a record is created, what happens when a record is created, and it also gives you the building blocks that you would really need to extend or start designing an application that is going to fit your specific needs. So what the platform layer basically does is it controls access to items through security. So it's going to use that security role or the CRM security model to determine who should be able to access what within the application, to make sure that regardless of what people are doing, whether it's accessing a new record directly through the application or whether it's through an import functionality, that whoever is initiating that item has the ability to do that based upon what security has been associated with their account. The other thing that it does is it controls who has access to the database. And when we talk about who has access to the database, what we're talking about is who has the ability to create new fields in the application, who has the ability to create new tables in the application or make schema changes to the application database itself. Because from an application standpoint, the CRM model does not actually allow you to modify the database directly. You actually have to access it through the customization tools, which are done through the platform layer. And this is also what's going to raise events in the application. So when you create a new record or you update a record, it'll register an event in the application. And this is where we can have some of our automated processes like workflows or maybe custom business logic actually be triggered based upon what somebody's doing within the application itself. So this is really the entire infrastructure that you're going to need in order to really implement a complete CRM application when you're working through it. And so the platform layer, as I mentioned, that's what's really going to talk to the database layer. And the database layer obviously is what's going to store all of the information. And so it's very important to note that since the platform layer is going to handle all of that interaction, that is the only supported way that you can interact with a CRM database. With only one exception, and these are what are called SQL filtered views, you do not have the capabilities to go in and directly interact with the CRM database. So I couldn't go in and just add a field directly at the database. I couldn't go in and update field properties in the database. You actually have to go in and use the platform layer to work with that. And that's important to note because if you do any direct database modifications, you may not be able to upgrade moving forward because it's technically considered unsupported and those customizations may not work when you're working through it. As I mentioned, SQL filtered views, which are primarily used for reporting, is really the only exception. Again, you're not actually modifying information at that point, you're just interacting with it from a reporting standpoint when you're working through the application. So this is a nice visual to really show you what CRM looks like from an architectural standpoint. So up at the top, you can actually see more of the client or front-end standpoints. And so these would be the clients that would be connecting to the application. You see we have USD, we have web, we have the Outlook client as well as the mobile application. And then from an interaction standpoint, you can see that all of that information will interact with CRM's web services. Now this is primarily used for a visual when you start talking about extending it, but it's nice to see how the different layers work together. So you can see the top layer is kind of that client access layer. The web services is actually the platform layer that is going to be interacting with the database. And then when you get down to the database down at the bottom, that's where you truly have all of your information that you're working with, such as your entities, your accounts, contacts, so on and so forth. Now you can see that within this, you also have your reporting mechanisms that fall within this. You also have some of your front-end and back-end integrated applications that would interact with that information, as well as some reporting information that would work through. And the reporting one you can see is the only one that actually has an arrow that directly goes back to the database level, which would allow you to use SQL filtered views to run some of the reporting mechanisms from an application perspective.